Hello, friends, and welcome back to Heartscapes, where we are exploring the system of Reiki at the intersection of self-reflection, spiritual practice, and social action. My name is Michaela Daystar. Welcome back. I'm here today with Carrie of the Reiki Healing Society, and we are in the midst of a series of conversations around the topic of integrity, of being true to our way, cultivating integrity in our Reiki practice. And this conversation has flown out of a variety of conversations Carrie and I have had over the past couple of years around, what our personal evolution as Reiki practitioners and teachers has been around being true to our values, being true to the way that we feel rooted and grounded in our practice, and ultimately how we've cultivated a feeling of integrity inside of ourselves. We opened up by talking first about what does it mean to have integrity in our self-practice? And then we flowed from there, what does it mean to have integrity in terms of the culture around Reiki, around the system of Reiki. And today we're going to be talking about what does it mean to have integrity in the interpersonal relationships in our Reiki practice. So integrity with others as we navigate these relationships. And so I'd love to invite you, Carrie, to just get us started and talk about what does that mean to you when you think about having integrity in the interpersonal relationships within your Reiki practice.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's really an interesting topic. And this one in particular, I felt like was one that I really had to siphon through for myself. I had to struggle with it in terms of, I'm not classically trained in psychology or any other field that really dives into creating proper boundaries between, yourself and who you serve. And so I've always really had to navigate this role of integrity with my clients and giving Reiki to others without any manual, right? Without any sort of textbook to guide me. And I would say that there are some, guidelines in terms of ethics of practice that the ICRT developed. And so I do use those as a foundation for me to provide Reiki effectively and with integrity to others. But in the process, there's a lot of things that have kind of come up for me. Number one is sometimes a struggle between boundaries with my students and clients. And if I did study classically with like psychology, for example, there's a clear line, a clear boundary that your psychologist is not your friend, it's not your there's no romantic relationship that's acceptable within that dynamic and that relationship. But and I think I do espouse those kinds of boundaries with my clients, but at the same time, there's times where I really felt drawn to a particular client to be a friend, and also with my students. A lot of my students kind of came to me, not so much. I mean, some part of it was to study Reiki, but I also felt like a genuine friendship and a genuine connection, like of equals, of peers between my students and myself. And so there's always been a little bit of that struggle. It's like, how do I, create and maintain professional boundaries, but also respect that sometimes people come through my business and different types of relationships develop over the years. I never had a romantic relationship with any of my clients. Thankfully, I always followed that boundary, but I guess that I always really struggled with that. But then also really struggled to within just the context of Reiki of like, how do I share Reiki effectively with others? And what do I share as a practitioner? What's my role for another person and as I'm holding healing space for them? What do I share? What do I not share? And what am I qualified to share? And I feel like I've really had to again, go through that process without a manual, without a whole lot of structure to support, the challenges that come with being a Reiki practitioner, balancing what expectations our clients might have of us, but also balancing the challenges of the ego and working with somebody else inside of, we all have egos, and I have one. And there's times where, I mean, there's a conversation in Reiki that says, you know, you can set your ego aside. But what I always share with my students is there's some days where it won't be set aside. It's just going to be there, and we have to work through that. And I see this a lot in the Reiki forums that I'm a part of too. I don't think that I'm alone in that struggle of how to really effectively relate to another person, how to share space as a healer with them, how to share Reiki with integrity. Um, and you know, how to ride some of those dynamics that might arise, like a desire for deeper friendship or connection. Um, and then also being really clear about what the scope of my practice is, and where the line draws, where I feel like that person's problems are a little bit beyond what I can support them with. And then being really clear about, well, what can I support you with, and how does Reiki really help others? So those are some of the issues that I've struggled with in the world of having integrity with others in Reiki.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's such a huge topic, really, right? Because unless we are strictly in self-practice, then practicing the system of Reiki brings us into a relationship with other people, and oftentimes a very connected relationship. And I think it makes a lot of sense to do what you did, just to look at it through the lens of boundaries, and where do we um, set boundaries for ourselves and for others that are either firm or flexible or some combination, and to potentially look to other fields to help us to understand how we might hold that. Not that we're beholden to those other fields. I mean, I think the boundaries that are set in the realm of psychology are, very, very rigid for a reason. We may not need to go so far in that direction, but there's a lot of valuable perspective inside of those spaces where there are a manual, as you say. There is a agreed upon guideline for how we interact with the people that we work with professionally. And I should say that people listening to this who have some relationship with working with others in terms of Reiki, your situation might be different from ours. There's a wide range of ways in which people work with other people. So we're talking, primarily from the perspective of sharing Reiki with others professionally, sharing it as a part of your work, those kinds of contexts. When we're sharing with friends and family, these things might look a little bit differently, but just holding that perspective and looking at it through the lens of boundaries, I think makes a lot of sense. One of the fields that I turn to a lot in terms of thinking through these things and kind of codifying these things inside of my practice is through the lens of trauma-informed work, and particularly through the lens of trauma-informed yoga, trauma-informed mindfulness meditation, and other sorts of teaching spaces where there is a closeness, there is an intimacy, there is a vulnerability that gets opened up in the context of the work that people are doing together. And inside of that, there is, it's kind of incumbent upon us to have some understanding of the fact that people are going to show up in that space with different needs, with different things that might, feel comforting or quite the opposite of that. And, as I've done a lot of work in that area, and, starting first and foremost with myself, realizing that, pretty early on in my Reiki practice, that we as a culture of practitioners don't have that manual, right? Don't have that set of guidelines, don't have, teachings built into the way in which we normally teach each other how to practice the system that really accounts for some of those things, that accounts for how we make space for difference, how we set aside our need to be in control of somebody else's experience, related to the conversation around ego that you just referenced. How do we make space for allowing people to feel that they have given consent for what they're experiencing, that they are in control of their own experience? And there are guidelines for those things that exist in other fields. And so it's been really illuminating and very useful to take those guidelines and to look at our specific circumstance as Reiki practitioners and say, okay, how does this apply? How does it not apply? What are the conditions and the types of relationships, the types of interpersonal connection that are specific to Reiki that, might benefit from these perspectives? And that's, become a really important lens through which I think about this question of, how do I want to relate with other people in my practice in a way that feels like it's in good integrity? And again, primarily through the lens of my practice, my professional practice, but also in the friends and family interpersonal realm. Just how do I want to create space for everybody, including myself, to feel safe, to feel trusting, to feel like I'm in control of my own experience, that others feel that way as well, and that consent has been given to the experience that people are having. And it's been an interesting road, like taking those perspectives on in my own practice. I ended up identifying about 10 different principles of trauma-informed care that felt relevant, that wanted to be worked with. And then beginning to share that with other folks. Like, it's been really interesting to see the conversations that have flown out of that, some of which you've been a part of and contributed to. And, you've seen some of the tensions that come up, when we invite our colleagues to think about these things that we just have not been asked to think about in the context of our Reiki practice. Where are the places where mistakes that we might make might cause harm, might cause tension, might cause disconnection between ourselves, might cause an overstepping of boundaries, as you're speaking to. Where does friendship and, with a client start to make the work that we're doing together challenging? I mean, I've had experiences like that of becoming friends with a client or a student, and then, having to renegotiate that boundary of, how it is that I'm able to hold space for them, and, getting in my own head around, what does our friendship mean? And like, there's just all of these things that, we can navigate, but we do need some structure around. We need a little bit of containment around. Yeah, so those are some of the things that come up for me. And I think it's both there's an interesting opportunity in the fact that we have a well-established, like, professional community around Reiki that's been in existence for a long time, that doesn't have these kinds of manuals and structures that you referred to. There's a lot of challenges that creates for us, but there's also opportunities to think about, in what way do I want to take responsibility for creating cultural structure around these things, not necessarily, rules and regulations, but where do we want to, and where must we take responsibility for setting these things, culturally inside of our practices. And that's a really open-ended question, and one that I think we're just kind of getting into the beginning of.
Totally. I think it's really, so I think Reiki might attract, a certain type of person who enjoys the freedom, of the practice of Reiki, in the sense that there aren't a whole lot of rules, that there is a tremendous amount of creative freedom, intuitive freedom, to show up for your clients in a way that is true to your way.
Yeah.
But there's, I think comes with some challenges, and looking more closely at integrity and how we can better support each other as we move through the dynamics that may arise in our practice, but also creating some best practices that really meaningfully support each other. And I really want to applaud you for the trauma-informed Reiki training that you developed, which was just incredible. And so for anybody listening who has not taken that course with Michaela, I just totally encourage you to do it. Any Reiki practitioner, I think, should have this tool in their toolbox. Mm-hmm. And what speaks to it for me is, so I had somebody mention this to me, a business coach recently. She was like, Reiki can sometimes be a little bit classified as one of those drive-through certifications. And potentially, depending on who you're studying it with, right? Is maybe with Udemy or anything, it's like you go through the drive-through and people are just throwing a certificate out the window,
I've never heard that analogy applied, but it's tickling me.
It was totally tickling me too. And I was talking to her and I was like, I think that that's everything that's wrong about Reiki in some senses, because, or everything that I really stand against, because I studied Reiki with such a depth and such a tenderness, of such a love for the practice over a period of 15 years. And so over time you get to realize, like, just taking a training just scratches the surface of what's available within Reiki. And I think that there's a lot of people who are very poorly trained within Reiki. And anyone who's listening, it's not judgment. It's really just, or criticism towards you. It's more criticism towards the practice and practitioners who potentially have been a little bit out of integrity, I think, with sharing the practice of Reiki and in authentic and integrous ways. But I do think it's super valuable to study Reiki from a gifted and experienced instructor. What I think is somewhat problematic is this this license that we give to our intuition within Reiki. And
more about that.
yeah, so there's a lot of talk within Reiki. It's like, whatever your intuition tells you, go for it, do it, listen to your intuition. But I'm grateful that in my practice, I have also balanced, some of the rhetoric within Reiki within the context of yoga. And yoga speaks actually a lot to the idea of what's going on in our mind and what is like authentic intuition, as opposed to mind chatter, as opposed to anxiety, as opposed to worry. And I don't think Reiki practitioners are structured enough to really unpack that after a Reiki 1 training or Reiki 2 training, or sometimes in the case of even after taking Reiki level 3. And that within this like culture of drive-through certifications, we're trying to give our Reiki students way too much stuff. We're giving them, a Reiki certification, a psychic surgery certification, an ability to provide spiritual guidance to our students and clients. And it becomes problematic. And so I'm of the opinion that a Reiki training is a Reiki training, and it teaches you how to provide Reiki. I am of the opinion that it doesn't qualify you to be a spiritual guide for somebody else. I am of opinion that if that is part of your way, or you feel that intuitive draw towards offering spiritual guidance to people or providing psychic insight to people, that you should continue to study how to use that in your practice with another teacher, with your teacher in greater depth. But I don't think a Reiki training in and of itself gives you that skill or ability, that it is beyond the scope of a Reiki training. And so for those who have that gift, I have that gift, and it's something that I've had to develop for many years, and to really learn within myself, when is it appropriate to share spiritual guidance with people and when it isn't. And I think what you spoke to is that, to me, it really comes down to consent. And I've worked with a lot of different types of people in my Reiki practice, people who have been very open to spirituality and like come to me to get like a psychic reading in some ways. Like, they're looking for insight, they're looking for guidance, they are looking for an answer that they can't find yet within themselves. And I think Reiki can illuminate that for most folks. It really does help. And why it helps is a little bit maybe beyond our conversation today, but there's also somebody who's come to my Reiki practice that is not open to that. And you can read it almost completely off of their language, how they're speaking to me, how they're the questions that they have. And so there's this subtlety in letting your client really lead the session and that have their intentions really guide the practice that I share with them. And some of that is not necessarily opening them to all that I have to offer as a healer for them that day, but really deeply listening to how they need help and seeing if I can provide it, you know. And I say I within like the context of like I'm in that role of healer for them that day, that's the transaction that we've agreed upon. And that through that transaction, I am providing Reiki, which is something that I studied in depth for many, many years. And that even though that they already are Reiki, that our work together can support this like illumination of the wise guide inside of them.
Yeah.
So that's really important to me in terms of integrity, is like, how can I work with my client in the subtle ways and in the more direct conversational ways to help them explore what Reiki can help them with inside of the context of their problems and challenges. Yeah. So
Yeah, there's a couple of things in there that feel, well, one that feels really related to our last conversation about integrity within culture, and then one that feels related to a conversation I just had earlier today inside of a Reiki Origins class that I taught. But in our last conversation around culture, one of the things that we touched on is the importance of, understanding a modality, a practice, inside of the context of its own history, right? And honoring specifically where a particular practice came from, understanding it to the best of our ability, understanding the components to the best of our ability, so that if we choose to blend it with another practice that we have also studied to the best of our ability and its authenticity and its integrity, we choose to blend them, then we are doing that with integrity because we understand the separate components, we understand them in and of themselves and how they might blend, as opposed to kind of throwing everything together, as you're saying, in a training that kind of muddles the waters between different things. It's not to say that things can't be blended in a really powerful and integrous way, but part of it being that way involves, really deeply engaging with each thing on its own terms. And so if we, want to include spiritual direction or guidance, that we have had a teacher, we've had training, we've had experience in the realm of spiritual guidance, and then we can bring that into our Reiki practice. There's another practitioner we're in colleagueship with who does a really amazing like coaching program, like spiritual coaching with Reiki as part of how that coaching, evolves. That's a 7-month program that she offers. That's Christine through Reiki Cafe. And that's assuming that you already have some Reiki training. And then there's the 7-month coaching program. So you're going really in depth with each of those modalities, and then you're exploring how they come together in your practice and your life. So that's a really important piece that you're bringing forward there. And that really, shows how when we come into integrity with these things in one realm, say culture, that naturally is going to allow us to be more in integrity in the interpersonal realm. The other thing that stood out related to the conversation earlier today is that we seem to have a certain aversion in our Western culture generally. We can apply this to a lot of different aspects of our culture, and then it shows up inside of Reiki, which is this aversion to simplicity, right? Letting something be simple, letting something be straightforward, and then going in depth with that simplicity. One of the other practitioners in this class earlier today talked about a few students that she'd had who just automatically started rewriting the precepts and making them more complex and more, interesting to that student, and started designing new ways of interpreting the symbols and mantras, perhaps going to your point about letting that intuitive aspect get a little bit out of control, and complexifying the system almost immediately before really even practicing it. And that felt like something I've seen before and something I've felt before, like this desire to make things more complex than they are. Like something as simple as live as an embodiment of the precepts, and here's some simple practices to help you get there. That seems too simple to be powerful and deep and effective in transforming our life. And yet that is the system that we have, that was created and that we are, endeavoring to work with. And so there's a piece around just like letting things be simple and acknowledging that just because it's simple does not make it easy. That it might be simple to say, healing looks like living as an embodiment of these 5 precepts, but it's not easy to go and do that, to live that in our day-to-day life, to actually embody compassion, deep compassion for myself and for all other life, all the time in my life, in every decision that I make, right? This is not easy. So I just appreciated the way that, what you just shared really emphasized that point again, is that let this practice be itself. Let it be simple. And then let yourself, through that clear and simple lens, take it to deep places through your diligence. Before trying to bring in lots of other different modalities and lots of other different traditions that we may or may not have a good grasp on. I think it's a really important point.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it speaks to ego, too, is that it's the ego that drives us to take something and say, okay, I got this ball now, and now I'm gonna like write over it or paint over it, color it. Well, I think that it really does point us back to the last conversation you and I had, Michaela, around cultural and spiritual appropriation, is that the ego has a big role in, and sometimes it's the ego that would take something like the precepts and it would just be like immediately like, I need to rewrite it with my own language or in my own flavor or with my own perception around it without really going deeper into the practice of it. And I talked about it in our last conversation about when I first started teaching yoga in particular, it was like kind of an unspoken rule was that eventually you'll create your own style of yoga, that's the goal, right? And so I think sometimes even from the outset, there's this goal that you will become a healer of your own, like very individualistic way. And I don't think that being true to your way has to be so fiercely individualistic and about, there's like this egotistical desire to be this bigger person, to be this enlightened being. And the question is sometimes for what, if we can't serve others, if that goal to be a bigger part of ourselves is really only about comparison and putting other people down or other people below you, I think that there's a problem with that, So I like to think of myself as somebody underneath supporting people to rise, that's really my role as a teacher and a healer. My goal or my hope for my clients and my students is to spark this inquiry within themselves that they feel they can tap into their own inner wisdom. That it's not me providing all of the answers for them. And in fact, that they are given and resourced with skills to find that energy or to find that insight within themselves. And that I'm just here to support that process.
Absolutely.
So, that's one of the things that I really try to share with my clients. And it's challenging. It's not easy. It's not, and every single Reiki session, I feel like I'm standing on top of every single one that's come before me. I've learned so much from every time I interact with somebody. I know every single Reiki session is going to be different. There's times where I've come, to the table feeling really balanced and relaxed and centered and ready. Other times I felt really unstable, out of my gourd, in my own process. And that the process of just sitting in the practice of Reiki has been incredibly grounding and stabilizing for me. And so it's been important for me on those days is to give myself that freedom that I don't have to talk the whole time in a Reiki session or be speaking to things when the drive to be sharing that with them is only coming from trying to show them a value that I have that isn't inherent.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
Well, it does. And it's like, from the perspective of its origins, you know, life's blood of Reiki is remembering our interconnection, right? And decentering, it feels like a paradox because on the one hand, from its origins, Reiki is self-practice, right? The idea of doing Reiki on other people, not part of the original intention. That's something that's evolved over time. But that evolves out of the fact that when we do tend to our own self-practice, then we move through spaces in a way that influences other people. That's not the same thing as centering our own enlightenment, as you were describing, and that individualistic kind of drive that we tend to have, when the real medicine, the real magic inside of this is remembering our interconnection with each other. And the other piece there is that, part of why we wanted to have this conversation and why we wanted to be vulnerable and share it out publicly on our YouTube channels is that we're not perfect in this, like this is ongoing, like the quest to experience ourselves as in integrity in our practice, in something that not only is our work, but is also, our own path to self-improvement and self-development. We are in the process of figuring that out all the time. Right. And so, I appreciate that we can have this space to be vulnerable and say, hey, here's the places that sometimes we're not feeling that are working well. Here's what we've learned about that. Here's the changes that we've made. And we really invite those of you who are listening to share those experiences that you've had that are similar with us, because this is really not about us individually. This is about us collectively as a community of practitioners, as a community of clients, of just anybody who touches this work in whatever role that they may have, deepening in our capacity to be authentic and connected and respectful and in integrity, ultimately, with this incredible gift that we get to experience. And so as we come to the end of this conversation, we really want to invite those of you who are listening to join this conversation, to share your experiences, your questions. If there's something that we've said that's felt off to you, or that's felt interesting, let us know. We want to continue these conversations. You are watching this video on my channel, Heartscapes Reiki. The next video that will be in this series will be looking at what does it mean to have integrity in our business as Reiki practitioners, specifically looking through the lens of business. And that video is going to be over on Carrie's channel. And so we will add the links to these videos so that you can jump back and forth between our channels and keep up with this conversation as they go along. They'll be down in the show notes. So Carrie, any parting words for our friends as we close today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing I just want to say is that being part of, being true to your way, just not being afraid to simplify it, and then not being afraid to also really own what you share with your clients as really relevant and important, creating different systems and structures that you can share the importance of the guidance that you receive through Reiki to them in a way that feels really good. I think all of that is super important. And if you're struggling in that realm, reach out to us. We'd love to chat more about it. I think it's nuanced. It's different for each of us. But if you have gifts that are beyond your capacity, just as a Reiki practitioner, I think including them within your scope of practice is a beautiful offering. I wish for you that you have a lot of confidence in sharing the gifts that you have to share as a healer. And hopefully this conversation supports you in feeling stronger and more confident to do that.
Absolutely. And as you walk along that journey of aligning and embodying your values in your practice, however that looks for you, embodying integrity in your practice, may you be deeply provisioned for that journey. Until we see you next time, we love you. Goodbye.
Bye.